Ago.
Amen.
Ago. All right, we are here for what promises to be a very exciting, engaging, edutaining presentation from our visiting Fulbright scholar, Professor Monica Tetzlaff, visiting from University of Indiana, South Bend. And she'll be working on alleged witch camps, Outcast homes of Pwaanyankura-foango, a recent history of Ghanaian human rights work in contested spaces. And today we have our very own honorable, praiseworthy, and distinguished Professor Albert Kanlisi Awedoba, born in Tamale. I won't be able to go through his entire biography because it would take us the entire 1 hour and a half. But just to let you know that he is very well versed in northern Ghanaian communities, oral literatures, Kasina riddles and proverbs, corruption in Ghana, northern region conflicts and response mechanisms, reproductive health, family planning, Kasem grammar phonology, and many, many more. So with no further ado, I will pass this on to our honorable, praiseworthy, and distinguished chair, and he in turn will pass it on to Professor Monica Tetzlaff.
Morning, ladies and gentlemen. Yeah, it's been a pleasure to be here again to continue with our Thursday tradition. This time around, the speaker is Professor Monica Tetzlaff. I'm not sure whether the name properly, yes. Until now, I didn't know she's also called Maria. So she's called Professor Monica Tetzlaff. As a matter of fact, she doesn't require any introduction. And I'm saying this because she's been here since last year. She also teaches some of our graduate courses. So she's someone that we've seen quite a number of times. But all the same, for the sake of those of our audience who are not members of History of African Studies, I think it is in order to say a few words about Professor Monica Tetzlaff. She is a historian, and that is why she's teaching history in this institute. She took a degree, first a doctorate in history from the University of Pennsylvania in Philadelphia in 1995. She also holds a bachelor's degree in history from the College of William and Mary, I think obtained in 1986. Since 2002, she has been an associate professor at Indiana University in South Bend. There she teaches history, and she teaches a number of courses within the history department. Some of these courses are Introduction to American History, U.S. Women's History, African American History, Introduction to Black Cultures in America, Civil Rights History, Environmental Movement History, and so on and so forth. Just a list of some of the courses that she's been teaching in her own home university. In addition to teaching at, I guess, the various levels, undergraduate and graduate levels, she has served as the chair of the history department for several periods between 2004 and 2012. She has also served as the chair of African American Studies Committee between 2002 and 2009. She was a visiting professor at the University of Notre Dame, where she worked at the Department of History in 2000. Her area of research interest spans the fields of history of black women's struggles for freedom, race and politics, and so on and so forth. And for those of you who are conversant with American history, you realize that the name Abigail Mandana Holmes Christus rings a bell. So if you look at Prof. Tetzlaff's CV, you'll come across this name several times. And I guess she's done quite considerable work on this person. She has a number of publications to her credit. I will not list them. Maybe if you want to know more about her publications, you can talk to her. But it is clear that her work centers on empowerment, women, and so on and so on, especially the black experience within the US. I seem to extend the boundaries of this interest, women, their oppression, their struggles for freedom, and so on and so forth. Professor Tetzlaff has selected what I consider as an appropriate topic for this morning's seminar. The title of the seminar, as you probably see there, is Alleged Witches Camps, Outcast Homes, or Pwaanyankura-foango. I'm not sure whether I'm pronouncing the term correctly here. I don't speak that language, but I guess Pwa is women, Nyanga is old woman, Kura maybe in village, I'm not too sure. So she's looking at a recent history of Ghanaian human rights work in a contested space. So this is what this talk is all about. I think it's a very important talk. The issue of witchcraft, witches, camps, and so on and so forth is one that has engaged our attention several times. In a sense, it is recent because for a long time we never even knew that those kinds of witch camps existed until they really drew our attention. Today, she's going to give us an insight into how these operate and from the perspective of human rights work. So without much ado, I'd like to pause here and invite Professor Monica Tetzlaff to share her ideas with us. So Prof, the audience is yours. Thanks very much.
Thank you for that kind introduction, and I will continue with thanks. I won't, in the interest of time, I won't read everything here. My co-teachers here at the Institute of African Studies taught me a lot, so I wish to thank them, as well as my students and my fellow Fulbright scholars. I want to give a special thanks to Dr. Samuel Netahuso, who took me to Nani, and who has shared many of his insights about the Northern region. Of course, I thank the chair and the organizer of these seminars. I want to draw attention, first of all, with my photograph here, to the subject of my talk, the interaction between the Ghanaian human rights movement and the alleged witches. And my photo here is of Samson Lar of the Gambaga Outcast home, sometimes called the Go Home, but I will refer to it as Outcast home, because one of the issues of my talk is that we don't want to force anyone to leave spaces where they feel safe. But anyway, he is sitting in solidarity with the women who are the quote, inmates, but I will use the term accused, accused women, sometimes accused witches. But as we will see, language is very important. So that's one reason I've chosen the Mampruli word that's hard to pronounce. And I'll give it a try. Pwaanyankura-foango. And this would be old lady section. That's the way it's translated in the article where I drew that. And that's the section of Gambaga where the alleged witches reside. My introduction gives a little bit of an idea of what I do in the United States. But I also wanted to say that in the United States, I usually try to explain a little bit why a white person is in this field. And this is just my personal reason, but my family background coming from my parents being immigrants in Germany and living through the Nazi period when minority groups were very oppressed. I thought that race is a tremendously important issue in American history and want to address it for both white and black students and students of all races in the U.S. I was also invited to do this project by my colleague, Pwaanyankura-foango, who is a Ghanaian living in the United States and teaching at my university, doing a study of the alleged witches' camps. One of the things I do in the United States is I take students on tours, so I think it's very important to visit the places that one is studying, even though in history we go to the archives and we look at documents. And here is a very important anti-lynching activist, Ida Wells, the site of her newspaper in Memphis. She was driven out of Memphis for speaking out against lynching of black men and sometimes black women as well. Today, though, I'll focus on the Ghanaian context of those who are contending in these spaces. A brief review of the literature begins my presentation, then a recent history, and finally recommendations from the activists that I interviewed. I'll try to go quickly through the literature. Early literature saw witchcraft beliefs and practices as traditional, coming from a long ago time and remaining as they were. More recent writings see fear of witchcraft as part of modernity, and indeed some of the titles are Modernity and its Malcontents, things like that, to show that witchcraft belief continues. And why does it continue in modern times with people in education living in cities? One of the reasons is the anxieties about modern life and the rapid changes. In one of the videos that you can see on a different problem accused witchcraft in the Congo, young children are being accused of witchcraft, and it seems that the most vulnerable people in changing societies are sometimes the victims of these accusations. So a little bit more on that. Some of these are more in the Ghanaian context now, the titles and the authors. And finally, the historians. Most of them have looked at witch-finding cults, but they have laid the groundwork for some of the changes in beliefs that have occurred over time. In particular, the fact that there have been some periods of stability and then some periods, of more accusations. And we'll look at that in my recent history. Probably the most important articles that I'm dealing with deal directly with this question, so I've included the titles. And they're both published in books edited by Steve Tona here of the University of Ghana, but they take somewhat different views. Shower takes a human rights education view and looks for a public space to reduce witchcraft accusations and fight for women's rights through human rights education. And John Kirby emphasizes the rights of culture, a different definition of rights, looking more at the collective rather than the individual. And we'll come back to this at the end. Finally, Kwame has written about this in an international context, but focusing on sub-Saharan Africa. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on witchcraft belief because most human rights activists don't argue one way or the other whether there is belief. There is one activist, Leo Igwe, who's a prominent secular humanist who really takes on that issue. And I've heard him speak both in the United States and then by Skype. He's done work here recently in Ghana. But he's kind of an exception in doing that. So the summary of witchcraft belief, which I'm sure could be much more articulated more broadly by anthropologists here, is that there is a physical realm and a spiritual realm, and they affect one another. Spiritual power can be used for good or bad, usually for protection or to harm someone. Witchcraft activity occurs at night, and this is a sort of distillation of many different ethnic groups' beliefs about witchcraft, but these are some of the similarities. Witchcraft activity occurs at night, in the time of dreams, and witches can kill or harm during dreams, eating the flesh of their victims. Witchcraft power can be inherited or acquired voluntarily. Now, a little bit of geographic location of where we are talking. The Outcast homes are in various districts of the northern region, and the one that has closed, Pwaanyankura, was in central Gonja. Most of them are there in Namibia South, Yendi, East Mampruli, and Gushiki. This is a photograph of the Magazia. She is the leader of the women at Gambaga, and also the president of the Alleged Witches Network, Timbu Taba. Just wanted to start off with some current statistics from from AWAC, which is the Anti-Witchcraft Accusation Coalition Campaign Coalition. And what we can see from this is adults. Most of them are women, but it's important to point out that at NANI there are also men. These are some of the men that I met at NANI. The population seems to be going down at this time, but there have been rises and falls. What are the conditions in the camps? This is a summary again. Probably the biggest problem in the camps is poverty, which is a problem in the northern region in general, and of course broadly in Ghana, but even more severely in this area. There are small-sized huts, lack of access to water, and it's especially difficult for the extremely aged and disabled who cannot work and who must rely a lot of times on the other alleged witches in the camps who have very little to share and very little extra time. At Gambaga, all are registered for the National Health Care Scheme, and all children go to school through the efforts of the Go Home project, but this has not been achieved at other homes. And I did see some of the children when I visited Gambaga. So some of the changes over time, there's not been a systematic census. Various groups have taken censuses at different times. Siraj did it, that's the Mission on Human Rights and Administrative Justice of Ghana, did a census in 1997, finding 815, and 13 were men. The group I mentioned before, the Anti-Witchcraft Allegation Campaign Coalition, began keeping a census in 2000. There was a high for them of 5,452, and they have about 50 groups that interact in one way or another, NGOs, women's groups, and so forth, and they help them to take that count. Decreasing to 601, and that is a pretty substantial decrease, so that's one of the things that I want to look at. Is the human rights movement making an impact, or other causes making an impact? That's hard to know right now, but certainly we do see an encouraging downward trend. In the meantime, though, between those years, another author estimated the population at 3,000. And actually, its 2012 census, for example, had 1,126, while AWAC's was 2,608. One reason for discrepancies is that people are always coming and going. That some die, some are reintegrated, some the families just pick them up and take them home at some point, and they're gone. And overall, there isn't necessarily a person keeping track of who is working at that time or visiting someone or is back in the camp when the census is necessarily taken. So there are a lot of reasons why there could be a discrepancy. One thing to keep in mind, and I'll go back to the first chart on the numbers, is a lot of them are children. I'm not going to be focusing specifically on the situation of the children, but it certainly is a cause for concern if the children in the other camps are not getting an education. They are stigmatized, and some are second generation. in the camps. Some have been born there and grown up there. So that's something my colleague Kwaja Okra is focusing on more in his, he is an education professor, so that's his area. Ethnicity, region, and gender. It is true that people from all over Ghana and also from Burkina Faso and Togo are hosted at the camps, or the alleged witch camps. The predominant ethnic groups are the local ones in northern region: Nkomba, Dagomba, Namoba, Mampruli, and Talensi. Ethnic surveys are not done at every camp. These are not mainly the numbers from Gambaga, as we will see. Gambaga is the most studied camp. About 95% are women. And this is what the village looks like. The Outcast home. Round mud huts, which are the traditional, a little bit smaller than the usual, with no windows and with doorways. And women are organized into ethnic groups. Each one has a magazia. Now, there's a mistaken assumption on the part of the public that the alleged witch camps are run by the government, as if they were a refugee camp or something like that. They're actually based around shrines, and the government might choose to intervene in them, but they're not run in any way by the government. Some of the newest ones are not necessarily based around shrines, and that causes some problems that we can talk about, that there is no ritual cleansing at those places. So what does that mean? And they seem to have been the ones that are also suffering the greatest poverty, which may be because of their recent origin, and there hasn't been any kind of aid established there. But for various reasons, some new outcast homes are starting that are not based around shrines. Let's talk about a little bit about the shrines, who are controlled by Tindanas, or earth priests. They neutralize the power of witchcraft through their rituals, and the rituals involve things like shaving the women's heads. The women shave their heads, so actually a barber shaves it for them. They drink a concoction, and the earth priest performs rituals. This happens on a regular basis. The one that's been studied is the situation at Gambaga, and by a graduate student at Pwaanyankura University, and that he's gotten the closest to finding out what the rituals are. He wasn't allowed to take photographs, but he did sketches and related what was happening there. So going into now the history of how they came to be, the origins of the outcast homes. When I went to Gambaga, Samson Laura, the director of the outcast home, drove me past the escarpment where alleged witches were formerly executed. So banishment was one of the pre-colonial practices, but so was execution. During the colonial times, colonial officials wanted to keep execution, reserve that as something they had the right to decide over. So executions supposedly stopped during that time. But what's important to note here for our purposes is that a tradition of sanctuary is quite long. The one, again, we know the most about is the one in Gambaga, where Imam Baba, around 1870, this is from oral history, took pity on an accused woman, brought her to Gambaga. And this is a complicated story involving various levels of authority, both the chief of the Mampruli, and then also, or the Mamprugo, and then he turned it over to an earth priest who also was a chief at Gambaga. And this, John Kirby argues, is the most effective. When the chief is the earth priest, then the authority is really respected by the people around them, and it's possible for these women, once they have been ritually cleansed and their families have offered the proper sacrifices, they can go home. Now, still, it seems that even though supposedly they are now free of witchcraft, people might accuse them again. And in 2008, ActionAid found that there's about a 40% rate of return for those who were reintegrated in that year. So this, even though this is supposed to work, it is not quite complete. Nani has a similar origin, but I mean, it is a shrine, but it has a slightly different story of a priest from Togo who brought a stone to the Tindana, and this is now part of the shrine. This one is mentioned. I haven't done much research yet in the colonial diaries, but it's mentioned in the 1917 report. As I mentioned, I was privileged through the efforts of Dr. Samuel Nitabuso to attend a meeting with the Tindana and the alleged witches at Nani, and also a human rights worker, Mr. Simon Nagota. But to go back to the origins of Gambaga, Nani, and the other shrines, in the period from about 1900 to 1998, I don't have a lot of information yet on the early, that's why the title of the talk is the last 20 years. But it is known that witchcraft accusations increased in the 1950s in the uncertainty before the end of colonial rule. Then there appears to have been a period of stability or perhaps lack of knowledge, I'm not sure exactly, but certainly witchcraft accusations rose in the 1980s when in the northern region there was a great outflow of people, that is labor, foodstuffs and animals, and an inflow of imported goods, a new need for cash, and a growing inequality, as well as a poor state of social services. We're starting into the period of, which I'm sure you're familiar with, of the debt burden, many of the international issues that cause poverty, and including also the HIV/AIDS epidemic. Gushegu became an outcast home without a shrine during this time, with mostly Konkomba women living on the outskirts of a Dagomba town. Kirby traces this to the old rivalries due to slave trading, that the Konkomba were preyed upon by the Dagomba, and they have a lesser status in society, and also their priests and chiefs are separate. The Dagomba are the chiefs, and the Konkomba are the earth priests. And it seems like a compromise, but it means that the authority of the earth priest is not as respected universally. Drucker Brown's 1995 One Fieldwork finds that whereas in the 60s, the majority of the accused women at Gambaga were not Mampruli, by 1991 they were, and the fear of alleged witches was greater than in the 1960s. They feared witches among their own people. And so she does a gender analysis of this, seeing that it's not acceptable for a woman to challenge a man of superior rank. So that's one of the things that had been mentioned before, even by Esther Goody. But she adds to that there is this source of authority that women have within the home and over food, and that is kind of feared. It's a covert authority. And so she adds that to look at house and hierarchy. Those are some of the things she studies as an anthropologist. But she says what's different in the 1990s is women do have more access to cash, they travel more, and so there's increased anxiety about that. But she also sees a different form of witchcraft. I'm focusing on the camp, so I won't get into that too much, but it's an interesting analysis. I'm also interested in taking up this question starting in 1992, because that is when a bigger space opened up for civil society organizations to challenge various aspects of Ghanaian society. And Kathleen Fallon's book on women and democracy, and you may be familiar with her since she was working extensively here, looks at how there was a growth of women's movements starting slowly in 1992 and really accelerating around the turn of the millennium. Around this time, Simon Ngota also became the project supervisor of the Presbyterian Church's Gambaga Outcast home, and he has the longest experience of any of the activists at this time. Although the home actually started in the 1960s, and I'm going to be interviewing someone who has more records of the pre-1990s period when I go up to Tamale next week. Of course, 1994 was also the year of the ethnic conflict in the northern region, and this has had long-ranging effects, although only John Kirby has really dealt with this. He really looks at what is the Konkomba, the Gomba conflict that is also keeping women at certain of the shrines and making it very, very hard to reintegrate them. Scholars have studied female homicide due to witchcraft accusation mainly through the Daily Graphic, and so the numbers may actually be higher than 13 cases. There was also a case of male homicide due to witchcraft accusation, but this article focuses on the female. In that year, Amira Adam established an NGO at Gambaga in 1996, and this one eventually faded, and that's part of what some of the issues and problems have been, that not all local NGOs are able to sustain themselves, and sometimes good efforts happen and then they go away. This is Simon and his wife Alva Ngota, who are continuing to work now in Bushiku. 1997 was also a significant year because of the cerebrospinal meningitis epidemic in the northern region. Witchcraft accusations increased, and there was a very well-publicized lynching of 2 women at this time. So that galvanized attention by journalists and also activists, of course. In that year, a roundtable discussion was held, or a roundtable conference in Tamale by Siraj and the commissioner Emil Short. Apologies if I'm not pronouncing his name right. That conference report has shaped some of what happened later. Action Aid also began, sorry for the misspelling, work in Kikuyu Outcast home at that time. And during that time, a conflict started to develop. This is where the contested space really came forward. When the Siraj Commissioner and women members of Parliament came to Gambaga and told the women that they were free to go and they didn't have to stay there anymore, they said they didn't want to go. And so this arose from a fundamental misunderstanding. The Gambarana, the earth priest and chief, does not force them to stay. It's fear of what will happen to them in their sending communities that keeps them there. Nevertheless, the calls have continued to disband the camps because of the poor conditions that I indicated earlier. And so we'll see how that has continued to develop. In 2000, the Anti-Witchcraft Accusation Campaign Coalition was formed, and this focused more on the sending communities. Instead of looking at the camps as the problem, this particular movement sees the accusation as the issue, and how can we educate to change attitudes in the villages so that there are fewer accusations. In this time, the government also began to take a harder look at gender, partly as a result of those women's movements that had begun to flourish in Ghana, and they're pushing for greater advocacy for gender equality. But they had not yet at this time taken a great interest in the outcast homes. Management Aid was a local NGO that drew Alma Schauber, who wrote one of the articles on human rights, in at this time, and she helped to provide the funding from the German Development Service that helped to start the Anti-Witchcraft Accusation Campaign Coalition. Different workshops followed, and these seem to have really had an impact, and it seems to me, from my observation on paper and through interviews, and also video of one of the workshops, that they are culturally sensitive. They begin with a lot of discussion. There aren't so much people lecturing at other people as listening to what the beliefs are and then engaging them on what they think is fair. The thing that they do bring in is the law, the Ghanaian Constitution of 1992, and in support of human rights, and that accusation is defamation, and that lynching, of course, and battery are against the law, and that dignity and human rights are part of the Constitution. So these look at solutions and let the people come up with solutions. And also, before I go to the solutions, which are in another slide, some of the activists also started supporting those women and men who took their accusers to court, because it is, against the law in various ways. Now, this was not successful at first, but it was important for the publicity that one could do this. Okay, ActionAid also started to organize at this time. Only some high-profile journalistic attention began. Yaba Baidu had already started work on some BBC stories at this time, and I mentioned her later on when her film comes out. But at this time, Karen Palmer, a Canadian journalist, began living in Gambaga and did research for the book Spellbound, Inside Africa's Witch Camps. And Palmer and Ngota found the women at Gushegu subsisting on grains and other food left on the ground. They had been at the more established camps and shrines, and they had seen that there was poverty all over Ghana, but they and also Ahmad Sugar, who encountered these women, saw them as really the poorest of the poor that they had ever seen, truly just picking up crumbs and seeds from the ground and leaves to try to survive. And Ngota started at that time to his plan to leave Gambaga and to form a charity that would work with the Gushegu outcasts. ActionAid also did some significant work at this time organizing the alleged witches into a network called Timbutaba, We Are Together. And from the standpoint of my work in civil rights in the United States, it's very important not just to do for people, which doesn't really work in the long run, but to empower those who are most affected to advocate. And they used a program called Respect, or Reflect. No, I'm confused. I'll have it on the slide later on, which was developed in South Africa to work with the poor. It's both a literacy, empowerment, and action program. Once again, it was shown in the media during this time that witchcraft accusation and lynching had not ceased. In 2010, there was a horrific burning death of a 70-year-old alleged witch at Tema, and also that this was not a northern region problem. This was this act was committed by a pastor and some people who claimed to have put holy water on this, holy oil on this woman, but how she then got on fire is the questionable part, and they were charged with this crime. There was a march at this time by the network of alleged witches, which also shows the kind of activism that they were then capable of. I love this photo, which is an ActionAid promo photo of them all doing the Black Power salute, and nice reference to some of the activism in the United States. I don't know if that's how they saw it, but certainly it's a sign of their feeling empowered to take action. I should mention that Kikuyu is the southernmost of the camps, although it's still in the northern region, and that's where ActionAid has been active. Then you are probably most familiar about this topic with The Witches of Gambaga, which is an excellent film. One of the concerns when the film came out was that it was not supposed to be something that was for the global north. It was really supposed to be for the people of Ghana and sub-Saharan Africa, not to be judged as being, quote, backwards with witchcraft accusation, but to work on a problem within Africa itself. And some of the the funding actually stipulated that the film be shown mainly in Africa. And of course it was shown in gender studies class, the class that I will be teaching on Friday, Intro to Gender Studies, as part of the discussion. Now we show an excellent film called Pray the Devil Back to Hell about the women's movement in Liberia. But this is certainly part of the teaching of gender studies at the University of Ghana. Spellbound, the book by Karen Palmer, also came out in that year. Another group got involved. Sosiwen, the Southern Network for Women and Youth, released a video, What I Used to Know. The title is based on a woman who was accused and who said, everything I used to know doesn't count anymore. My life has been so completely changed by this accusation and by being banished to the camp. And Sosiwen is one of the groups that it's really encouraging, that has young women in it, and it has offered a workshop in Yendi that is on video. That's very interesting to see, and you can see that the young women who attend in Yendi are feeling empowered by this discussion. I think the problem is that one of the most recent articles by Sosiwen is disband the camps. The feeling, maybe on the part of urban women, that just bring these women into another situation and find them better lives, but that isn't necessarily the way that they see their future in the villages. So, a lot of the unanswered questions is what would happen if that occurred. So, some good work, but also some controversy out of that. 2011, another conference trying to figure out a roadmap. Here's a nice photo of Gambaga. She was born in Tamale but grew up in Britain, so has a particular kind of interest in this issue. Most recently, as a historian I get really uncomfortable. We usually try to wait 25 or 50 years before we analyze things, but here's a little historic journalism of the last few years. Sadly, there's been quite a bit of news still of accusation. However, the good news is these 40 persons, for example, who are on a list that vigilantes had, went to their doors, they resisted. They resisted these accusations, and they were not banished in the end. So that's part of what might be happening in an urban context, but also certainly the people who resisted felt empowered. ActionAid issued a report in that year with that statistic that I mentioned earlier based on 2008. And they are often known as a group that wants to disband the camps. They are the architects of the roadmap that's currently on the table. But they say in all of their documents that they want this to be done gradually and for no woman to be forced to return. So at least that's what it says in that document in 2011, and that's what was said in interviews that I had recently. Again, court cases continued, and an amicable settlement was reached in this one that lasted from 2013 to 2014 between those who were accusing and the accuser. I attended this 2014 December 10 conference in Accra, so now I come here as a citizen journalist, I suppose, to tell you a little bit about it. This is from my seat behind some of the traditional leaders. There was a great variety, except there was only one person from Northern Region who was a traditional leader. So two of my friends that I made in this movement, Ken Ade and Sister Fati Al-Hassan, were critical at the conference of the fact that it's very difficult for those in Northern Region who work most closely with the Outcast homes to come to a conference in Accra. And the good thing about the conference in Accra, it also featured prayer camps and other abuses that are happening in the Southern Region and throughout Ghana. And certainly the whole nation needs to be on board. There's nothing wrong with drawing in people from the other regions. However, because of the poverty in Northern Region operating on a shoestring in their NGOs, this was a difficult one for them to attend. Traditional leaders, religious leaders, political leaders were all represented here, and that was an encouraging sign. There was a great speech by a professor who talked about his mother being accused and how the family resisted the witchcraft accusation at the shrine. And if you have strong family support, then it's very, very important in being able to resist. Nearly every speaker had at some point been accused. And these included government officials or had a family member accused, but none of them had been lynched or banished. So there's a difference between accusation and then having those end results, which are so worrying to human rights. This is from my visit to Tamale. This is a photo from the Grassroots Sisterhood Foundation. I'll just mention that these NGOs, local NGOs, have other focuses than witchcraft accusation, but they are prominent members of that coalition, AWAC, the Anti-Witchcraft Accusation Coalition. TUDEG, the Human Help and Development Group, focuses on aged people and the disabled, but obviously a lot of them are the ones who are subject to some of the accusations, so they've been involved. And then the Grassroots Sister Foundation looks at land rights for women in northern region and other issues of widows, and it is about 80% of those accused are widows. Being a widow, being barren, these are all high indicators of being accused. Now let's get to some of the good news of what came out of the 2000 workshops and how those things may have reduced accusations during the time period that we're looking at, and certainly may have also encouraged resistance. This is a matter for study. What can be determined is that there were drama campaigns in many villages that were determined to be sending communities to the outcast homes. These drama campaigns that are run now by Simon Ngota feature some of the accused women themselves or actresses who are young people playing them, all local and all locally written. Here at the University of Ghana, there have also been activists involved in writing some of the dramas, but drama campaigns have been held. Radio jingles were composed in local languages and English, and discussions were held on radio programs. Upper East region was targeted as well as Northern region. I don't want to read Northern region out, but some of these did occur in Upper East and Upper West. Poster and pamphlet campaigns, I'll show you the poster photo in just a moment. And lots of human rights and women's rights workshops for all kinds of stakeholders. For example, police wives. This is a sensitization program, and that's where I talk about where they have the discussions. What is witchcraft? What are human rights? How can we resolve the conflict and come up with solutions? And the solutions they came up with were the drama campaigns, the jingles and discussions, and the poster and pamphlet campaigns. Here's one of the posters, and because the light was shining on it, I'll read it. Killing is a crime. Branding or lynching a woman alleged of witchcraft, women alleged of witchcraft is a crime. Join us. And that's part of the message too, is that there is this movement, the anti-witchcraft accusation campaign. Join us. And we'll talk a little bit at the end about solutions, especially getting young people to join them, because they are primarily the ones who throw the stones, especially young men. They may not be the ones who accuse, sometimes they are, but they are the ones who are then the perpetrators of the abuse. All women must be respected and assisted. I really like that this has a positive aspect, and certainly part of all African cultures is the respect for the elderly. And the modern era is what has been breaking this down with older people not being seen as useful in Western society. And so this is really a call to a return to a traditional value here. Show love and concern to women accused of witchcraft. these are some of the people that I met along the way, and I see the Presbyterian Church as Gambaga Outcast Home program as a model. In some ways, they're fortunate in that they have the situation where the Gambarana is an earth priest and a chief, but they also provide a model of peaceful reintegration because of the sustained presence of this NGO. They have been there since the 60s, and he lives there. This is what we in the United States, in sort of the social justice movement, call accompaniment, where you don't just go in, have a workshop, and leave, but you actually live in the community, and you bring resources. You don't say that, hey, you can do everything yourself, and I'm just going to sit here with you. Yes, I'm bringing some resources, and you bring the resources of being the person who's having the experience. You have been accused. You are here. What do you want to do, and how can we work with you? The reports that he files, which he has shown me, show countless hours spent on each reintegration, both in prior visits to the family and the community, ascertaining whether it's safe, talking to each person to see if they're ready. They even wait a year before they try a reintegration because they need to get to know the family and so forth. They really don't want someone to go back and be killed. That has happened and was obviously incredibly demoralizing, and it felt like there's no point to this work. So they're very, very careful. And then they also do follow-up. And I talked to the AWAC people as well, anti-witchcraft accusation. They tried to also do some follow-up by having a woman in the community be kind of the lookout outside the family, and then keeping in touch with her, bringing her a gift. This is a voluntary role, but just various ways to make sure that those who are reintegrated are okay. They work with the Tindana, the Gambarana, and they have a program where people can sponsor someone for reintegration. For example, sponsoring a sheep, because often these are expensive. That's like 100 CD for the sacrifices that are needed for the reintegration. Works with the government, other NGOs to get other resources. One other fortunate thing about Gambaga is that it is a seat of government, so it receives a little more attention from the district commissioner, from the district assembly. Current features of the Outcast homes. Again, I'm going to talk a little bit more about Gambaga because I was there, because I see it as probably having the best conditions. Each ethnic group has a magazia, so there's a lot of self-government. At Nani and Gambaga, there are fowl houses, which has helped in nutrition, certainly with the chickens, and they're running all around, and goats are there too as well. Women in Gambaga engage in bead making and soap making. Various activities have been tried. Selling food is often very difficult for accused witches because people are afraid of their food. But these other items have done a little better. And I bought quite a few beads. I wish I bought more. They're quite attractive, and I've given them away, and I'll give away more. Okay. And I do tell people where they come from in case they would be worried, but in general they are not. There's a sense of community there. When I visited, someone had donated a big bag of sugar. And what was happening was they're dividing it up. And so I'm kind of peeking through the doorway while I was talking to Samson Lar and seeing that going on as each woman brought her bowl, and everything was divided, and there is, self-government in this community. When I did talk to the women there, I was looking for those kinds of things, how they help each other. But most of them still talked about being quite isolated and sad because they are separated from their family and their kin. So yes, they have found some companionship there, but that does not take away from the pain that they feel at the separation. Visiting Nani was somewhat different in that it was open air. The meeting was held under trees, and some of the women, it's a much bigger camp in terms of the population. And I showed earlier some of the men that are at Nani. There's quite a lot of farmland around there, so even though the crowd was big, many of them were out farming that day as well, so it wasn't nearly all of the people. So the resources are much, much more scarce. The children who were there are young, some of them, so they weren't in school, but also there are fewer resources for them to go. During that time, Simon Nagoda visited, and this was a very interesting interaction for me between someone who travels to some of the various camps. He's closer to Gushigu usually, but he came to Nani specifically because, for one, he had a donation, which was a gift of shoes, and used clothing is very much needed at the camps. The women come with nothing on their backs, and then definitely need things. A lot of these shoes were for the children in this case. But he also came to speak to the group about the fact that he had heard, and then this was later confirmed, that a woman from Bonyase, the camp that was closed, had ended up at Nani because her reintegration did not work. And so this was just about a week later that she was in a different outcast home. And then later, this was a story that was carried on the Ghana news. Okay. Some of them were successfully reintegrated, so we don't want to discount the positive. There were only 5. Sorry. So finally, this brings me to Kirby's argument for the rights of culture. How do we look at these outcast homes? I had the 3 different names on their alleged witches camps. When they're just called witches camps, they become sort of a sideshow, something that the outside world might see as something peculiar. Alleged is very important. I think most of the women deny that they're witches. Some do, quote, admit, but many of those confessions are forced. So, you know, as far as I'm concerned, I'll leave it at alleged. Outcast homes or the accused are some of the language that's important to use. But what Kirby is arguing here is that collective orientation is just as important as individual rights. And this quote I found a little bit provocative. It certainly made me think, if people of a collective orientation believe that their right to abundant life, which is what the earth represents, the positive spiritual forces of the earth, which he talks about a lot, is blocked by a life-negating force called witchcraft. And he sees also things as blood spilled in war, any kind of evil action or harmful action as polluting the earth and negating the life force. This must be attended to before the rights of individuals. So I don't think he's saying, and you might want to, engage me with this later, I don't think he's saying that there are no rights for individuals, but that in society, in this African society, the collective needs to be addressed through ritual. And there are rituals that address some of this, and we need to take that into account. And he argues in East Debon, temporary sanctuaries have become permanent because of the split in authority between the chief and the Tindana, which is aggravated by ethnic conflict. That one is the Goma, the other is Kakoma, and he sees the need to address this first before the individual. Recommendations of local NGO leaders and traditional leaders, as well as Catholic priests, a Dubsu officer, and the accused women and men I interviewed. Roundly, everyone unanimously said camps should not be disbanded quickly. Quite a number said they should not be disbanded at all. They should be closed gradually or transformed into, and here's the question of language again, women's shelters, that the old word Pwaanyankura-foango is old ladies section, so that's not a pejorative term. Perhaps that's what it could be again, with a little more emphasis on improving the conditions. These are some of the suggestions. Language matters. Also the program, if we do want to, quote, close the camps, that's not the word we should be using. That just rouses fear. I stopped using it when I was talking to the accused at all, because I noticed that is the reaction that I got. I asked them for their solutions without directly, saying, should the camps be closed? But peaceful reintegration is what the emphasis should be on, not disbandment. Conditions should be approved. Some people say this would increase numbers, someone, volunteering to be a witch, so they could get into this nice camp that has good roofs on the huts and so forth. That's pretty unlikely given the stigma and so forth. However, it would show that there is respect and dignity for the human beings in this place. The problem that everybody said is in the sending communities, not the homes. There's a continuing need to sensitize through the programs, and so the funding is gone for most of these, okay? So we've seen some success, but that could change as younger people haven't heard the message and so forth. So there's a continuing need. There's a need for a multi-stakeholder approach. No one NGO can do this alone, and that's the one problem I see with the roadmap, is that it relies very heavily on Action Aid, and there hasn't been outreach to AWAC and some of the other groups, only to the Gambaga Outcast home outside of Action Aid. Nor can the government do everything, and the resources are obviously very stretched, but as a kind of neutral party, and I say this with a grain of salt, others were indicating that they wanted to see the Ministry of Gender and Social Protection take the lead. Every kind of government and NGO workers should be sensitized. So this is, in the coalition, I mentioned that there were people who work on land rights or other issues, health issues, and it can be mentioned that this disease is caused by X and not by witchcraft. Literacy is very important. There are virtually no literate accused women in these camps. Literate women who are successful can usually defend themselves. They might be accused, but they can usually defend themselves. And so literacy is very important. And I see this, part of the problem is there aren't always enough jobs for everyone who has an education, and expectations are raised. But if we can combine sustainable agriculture and local types of practices with education, then I think it can be an empowering and viable thing. I'm sorry, I'm editorializing here a bit myself. Recommendations based on interviews. Youth, especially young men, must be involved so that they're invested in solutions, not accusations. And I think music is an area that occurred to me that might be useful. Women's groups should be organized. Those that aid widows and caregivers should be strengthened. Caregivers for the elderly, and then also the widows associations. Some of the women are in the camps because they became widowed and refused to marry their husband's brothers. So having alternatives for them and ways that they can find a place in society without becoming a quote burden in widowhood is important. Law enforcement should promptly bring to justice cases where lynchers are caught. And to aid in reintegration, women must be trained in some kind of income-generating activity if they're still young enough. I mean, some of them, basically, they need food to survive. And the roadmap proposes to put them on the LEAP program. Probably a little bit more than that is needed, but that is part of it. Those who are able, they need to have the skills, because if they're begging in the community, they'll probably be reaccused, because they are seen as a burden, and when someone refuses to give them food and they look at them the wrong way, then they'll say, you said, you'll see, and that's enough to say that that person accused them. The big solutions are empowering women, any efforts to do that, reducing poverty and mortality, crucially important. These structural adjustment programs that have cut health care access and other things are just worsening things. So very much so that the unexplained deaths, the deaths of the young, will be reduced, and then accusations will be reduced. That's almost for sure. So my final thought is that culture has changed. We teach this in African studies. Culture is dynamic, and if certain rituals can change, so can witchcraft accusation. This is not to negate culture, but to find a way to respect the dignity of those who are accused. Local people, with outsiders occasionally accompanying them, and find the best solutions. And I leave you here with a photo of some of the sources of wisdom who had the experience, the Magasia, who is the leader, and also the elder women at Gambaga. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed
for this very exciting presentation. I'm not going to try to summarize it because there's so much that Monica has given us. I wouldn't even know where to begin and how to put it all together without necessarily giving her a lecture, so I'm not going to do that. When she started talking, I had a number of questions, and as I listened to her, I realized that almost all my questions have been answered. And that is a measure of how detailed, how impressive this discussion has been, this talk has been. Nevertheless, before I open the floor, I should ask one or two cosmetic questions. One thing about witchcraft is the fact that it is a subject that is very perplexing and very puzzling. It enshrines quite a number of contradictions. For example, well, I agree with Kirby that we have to be very careful about some of the words that we use. So maybe words like accusation may not be quite right. But there is something that I find very interesting and difficult to understand. When we're talking about somebody pointing fingers, identifying who the witch is, usually it is the other, is the third person who points fingers at somebody else. But in the case of witchcraft, we do come across cases where people actually accuse themselves, and that also exists. And I sometimes want to understand. I actually have come across cases where individuals have accused themselves for the harm that has happened in society. It is a bit difficult to understand it. I don't know whether it's a kind of, whether we should invite a psychiatrist to try to give us an insight into why anybody would accuse himself of such a heinous crime. But I'd like to ask you whether in trying to profile the communities, the populations, and so on and so forth, you did draw attention to the fact that they are multi-ethnic, there are men, there are women, there are children, and so on and so forth. I'm happy to hear that you have addressed an issue which I was going to ask about the issue of widows, especially those widows who are left without any children to fend for their rights, especially in a context where there's scarcity, and the community or the society or the family has to have a principle for sharing the limited resources that are there. But it appears that even here there are young ladies who are in the camps. And I ask myself whether this has anything to do with urbanization. Is it possible that some of the young women we find trooping to southern Ghana to work may well be some of those people who are prone to those kinds of accusations? Because definitely I ask myself, well, if society is accusing me, why can't I move away? What I also don't understand is in a society where polygyny still operates, men like to have as many wives as possible, why would they let go their wives? Why would they allow their wives to leave home to go, witches' camps? It's something that I can't understand. I can't make sense out of that you have this kind of scenario, this kind of situation, and yet there's the other side of it. And you may not have answers to all these questions, but maybe it's something that we want to think about. So on that note, may I invite at least 3 questions from the audience? Yes. Read on the back.
Thank you very much for your stimulating paper. And Monica, you've done very well. But I don't know whether we can extend the research outside. We know in the north, it's all organized. So you are a witch, either yes or no. If yes, you end up somewhere very structured. But what about all the witches in the south? We have to look at the system and find out what happens to them. I mean, in a sense, what happens, I think the feeling is that we are not too keen on having people who are unusual or have maybe unusual abilities or what. That creates a problem. That is the fear. It's like, and especially they do it to women, you have to be a conformist. You have to behave the way your society expects you to. And if you don't, then there must be something wrong with you. And the easiest is to be accused of witchcraft. I'm saying that because I have been accused of witchcraft several times. When I was a student, I was a witch. Okay, that's why you could fight with your mouth. Eh? Then, what about when you are an intellectual group and still you are a witch? What do you do? What is wrong with that? Because you would think that witchcraft will be for the, as you said, non-literate. It will be for this and that, those who have. But even if people get accused, and I'm one of them, of being witches. And I just laughed it off. I thought maybe I also need to stop being too non-conformist so that it will be acceptable. What do we do with them? And when we are talking about South, for example, among the Ghan, when we have this system of the mediums of the gods. So some of the unusual people, they end up being mediums of the gods. Why? And they are able to commune with the gods on behalf of the people. They are able to communicate with the dead, on behalf of the people and the ancestors, on behalf of the people. They are able to cure people of diseases. They're able to do also, so there's a certain respectability attached to it. In other communities, they may be labeled as witches. So if you are looking at this whole system of witchcraft, we have to find out what happens to women in the different ethnic groups and how they come out. They come out. Because among my people, you will be seized, number one, by the gods. And then when you are seized, you go to a camp also. But the camp is presided over by a senior priestess who will teach you how to communicate, how to do unusual things. 12 midnight, they will ask you to walk from maybe Abri to Accra, the dead of night, communicating with the powers that be. So I think this whole business of powers that be beyond us, we don't see them, we don't know them, and they put fear in us. And then there may be a few people who may have insights with them. I mean, okay, modern times, respectability, there will be prophetesses in the Christian thing. So they will predict and talk about you. They have words of knowledge, so they have a nice tag there, prophetess, right? Then, in the not so enlightened places, there will be witches. And then there will be priestesses, mediums. So I think let's find out the connections between all this. It's a very interesting area of research, but you've done very well. Let's throw the net. Maybe you may end up being a witch yourself. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thanks very much. Bye-bye.
Okay, I'll keep it very short. You've mentioned poverty, and I wondered if you considered the economic system as a whole. You talked about modernity, taking on modern economic systems. When I look at the West, looking at places like America, there are old folks' homes, there are orphanages, and basically in capitalism there's a ready-made place to throw away your old people and throw away your children. As Africans are adopting these Western economic systems, it seems like witchcraft, I've looked at the Congo War to Witches documentary, Women of Gambaga. It looks like this becomes an excuse of now we are adopting a Western economic system and we don't have a ready-made place to throw away these people, so let's use witchcraft as the way to do that. So I wonder if you looked at economic system, and also earlier you mentioned Ida B. Wells in terms of fighting back against lynching in that context. One famous quote of hers is that the shotgun should have an honored place in every Negro home, was how she put it. I was wondering, you talked about legal means of fighting back. Have the people who are accused fought back, like literally actually tried to fight back in other ways, shapes, and forms? And finally, I wondered if you looked at the gender aspect from the Congo, from Ghana, of the children as well. Is it more young women, young men who are accused of witchcraft? For the old women, I've seen that, but in terms of the youth as well, how have you seen that breakdown?
Thank you very much, Professor Tetzlaff, for your presentation. I have basically two questions. I think your point on the dynamics between allegation and then responses with regards to the role that family backgrounds play in this whole issue was pretty interesting. The first question is that given the general poverty situation, especially in your area of study, I would like to know if there were other factors that actually would come to play in shaping social identities in these contested spaces. And then secondly, I would also like to know, in your study of especially the court cases with regards to these allegations, what especially did you identify as the impact of these judgments out of these court cases, and then how it has shaped the evolution of notions of witchcraft in these areas? Thank you very much.
Okay, I think I should try to answer these before I go on and lose track. Thank you for these good questions. Everyone is stimulating me here to some further thought. First of all, Prof. that is a puzzling phenomenon of those who accuse themselves, and that's a little bit beyond the scope of what I'm doing, but I will definitely try to cover what others have looked at there. Certainly if 90% of Ghanaians believe in witchcraft, which some studies show, and I apologize, I don't have the reference there, then it's going to be something that you might believe is part of yourself. But what I have seen in the literature is that anger and envy are very closely related to the notion that you have witchcraft within you. Being angry at someone or being envious of them, and this is talked about in Christian doctrine as well. That if you hate your brother, you might as well kill him. This is a sin. That those bad feelings, which we all have, I think can sometimes lead to a feeling that I've done harm to someone because I wished harm on them. That would be my best guess there. The profile of the communities, I'm glad you found that is true. In urbanization, I think we don't know how many accused witches are in urban areas, particularly young women. And I think I see even a little reluctance sometimes for people to say where they're from, if they're from northern region, or Gambaga in particular, which wouldn't make sense because most of the sending communities are different than Gambaga, but we don't know. There has not been a study of this, of how many just go away on their own and start life over, maybe with their whole families, maybe with some of their children. But certainly the ones who end up in the sanctuaries are ones who don't feel that that's an option. Why do men let their wives go? Some of them really don't want to. I mean, the woman you see in the center there, She was childless and said she had a very happy life with her husband. They made pito together. She sold pito, and it was people in the community. And in other instances, men have said, you know, I'm trying to get my wife out. So sometimes it is the husbands who accuse, but in other cases, they really don't want them to be there. And I'm going to jump to the question on self-defense. It seems like it's been very difficult for those who are accused in the lynching situation or the mob mentality to defend. But what seems to be in stories, and I haven't studied them systematically, is that sons are probably the best defense, or an outside male of some kind standing up and really forcefully yelling at the crowd, not using physical force, but moral authority, a voice, and saying, and now I'm going to take this woman away, which you have to do if you stand up. That's part of what goes on. If you stand down the crowd, then you take the woman to safety. So that has happened in a couple cases. There's a very vivid story, I think, in the Witches of Gambaga, where the son comes with his bicycle. So that's as much as I can say there. That deserves further study. Professor Odutai, the question of the broader witchcraft accusations in Ghana, I think it is worth studying in my larger work, looking more broadly at accusations in the South and among various ethnic groups and how they're handled, because there are many alternatives. Although the belief system is similar, there are so many different ways of handling accusation, and many of them purify the person ritually, and then they're back and they are accepted. So that's really important to study how that works and how that might work in some of these regions. Let's see. Poverty, and definitely part of the broader study needs to go into more detail on what has happened economically and how the elderly and children are being treated. I watched the documentary that you recommended on the child witches in the Congo. They seem to have as many boys as they had girls, but I didn't see the figures backing that up. The children, again, are the nonconformists, the stubborn children, or sadly also the sickly children, those who are a burden in many ways, in the capitalist notion of not having a collective community, but everyone having to fend for themselves for cash and for few scarce resources. And in a situation where we have 80% unemployment in the Congo, I mean, those are horrific conditions. And so I definitely want to have a structural analysis as part of my larger work. And I'm grateful to the gender and development class that's really helping me with that issue. Family background of those who are accused, poverty and social identity. Definitely, you know, one of the activists I talked to said they'd love to see the University of Ghana or Syngenta do a real survey of the camps, finding out the ethnicity at each one, not just at Gambaga, the easily accessible one, but really seeing what's going on, and in terms of what the class issues are, the social identity, the ethnic identity, and so forth. I don't know yet what impact the court cases has had. That is a good question to ask. Again, it would probably take some surveying, but I'll do some informal question well, not informal, but I'll definitely include it as an interview question when I go back, and maybe, you know, that would be a good follow-up for someone to do as a master's or something like that. Have you heard of the stories? You know, has it affected your opinion, and how that has happened? Thanks.
Just have a suggestion for the study. I think it would be useful to give us historical and global context, witchcraft, before you get into the Ghana-African thing. This will make it more useful for people to understand that witchcraft is actually historically a social phenomenon. And it's not just limited to Africa.
Thank you very much, Professor. I mean, this is a pretty delightful presentation. Very, very quickly, is there any other way to analyze these factors in gender? We always see the binary issues of men and women. Here, women are the predominant alleged witches. Is there anything in between? Can we find a prism of difference in looking at these societal problems? And two, have you been able to look at the individual and what we call the collective perception of this idea, trying to factor in issues pertaining to civil liberties as opposed to civil rights? Okay. And last but not least, when it comes to analyzing issues in gender, again, we end up with empowering women all the time. That gives us the premise that women are powerless, right? That's the premise. Again, is there any other thing we can use that is not as vague as empowering women to get them out of these mysteries? Thank you very much.
Okay, thanks very much. I think time does not allow us to take more questions, so I'll invite Prof. Tetzlaff to answer this question.
Thank you. Certainly there is a global historical context, and thousands, actually tens of thousands of women were killed in Europe during the Inquisition and the burning of witches, including in the United States as well, into the 1600s. So that's some of the global context that I think, I should have mentioned at the very beginning, and certainly the larger work will include some of that. And to move on to Prof. Suma's comment on gender, yes, there are powerful women in African society, and in the case of these northern region societies, the Magazia has a potential for positive and protective power as well as for harm. And so I think there are elements within the society. I would be very interested to see, how the Reflect or Respect workshop works in not just on paper, but in practice. And certainly any good program like that would draw on strengths that are already existing within the community, and they certainly are there, and historically they're there, and they're still to be found.
So thanks very much for sharing your ideas with us. I'm sure many of us will have questions and comments to make. Unfortunately, the time does not allow us to do that. So I'd like to suspend the discussion at this point. Maybe as we leave the hall, there's still opportunities to talk and discuss various aspects of the presentation. But let me, on your behalf, thank Prof. Monica Tetzlaff for sharing her research with us, and also for suggesting that there's a room for a second presentation where she's going to give us some of the insights that for some reason or the other, due to time constraints, she's not been able to share with us. So on that note, I'd like you to, I want to invite you to give another round of applause. Thank you very much.
All right, and give yourselves, as always, a big round of applause. This is one of our best showings of this semester. And in terms of our running out of time, you know that we will also do the YouTube videos, and for some of the ones from the past semester, we've had comments from people in other departments, other places of the world. So once the video is up, feel free to post your comments, questions. It's really an untapped resource. People aren't used to doing it, but that's another option for bringing in your ideas. And next week, we have another exciting presentation by Dr. Pwaanyankura-foango, dealing with academic freedom in African universities, dealing with a case study here at the University of Ghana. So that will definitely be something that you will want to look at. He's looking at it from a legal perspective as a lawyer from the Faculty of Law. So please come, tell your friends, tell your colleagues that there's something serious going on in African studies. So once more, we'll give a round of applause for a very thorough presentation today. We look forward to seeing you next week.